Millionaire finds ex at his mom's funeral, with triplets who have his hazel eyes. The funeral director was still talking when Matthew saw them. 3 identical little girls with his exact hazel eyes standing beside the ex-girlfriend who'd vanished 5 years ago without explanation. His mother's casket wasn't even closed yet, but the secret she'd been keeping was already destroying everything Matthew thought he knew about his life. Danielle grabbed the children and ran, but it was too late. Matthew had seen the truth written in those tiny faces, and now nothing would ever be the same. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The heavy silence of the cathedral was broken only by the low murmur of prayers and the subtle shuffling of black shoes on marble. Matthew Collins stood motionless near the altar, his tailored suit doing nothing to shield him from the cold reality of the polished casket before him. At 34, he carried himself with the controlled precision of a man who'd built empires through sheer will. But today, surrounded by lilies and grief, he simply looked lost. Matthew Collins was a name that commanded rooms. Tech acquisitions, international holdings, a portfolio that had earned him a Wall Street Journal profile just 3 months ago calling him the architect of modern venture strategy. He'd turned a single software startup into a 9-figure exit before 30, then repeated the feat twice more. His signature was worth millions. His time was measured in 6-figure increments. But standing here, breathing in the cloying sweetness of funeral flowers and listening to the empty platitudes of a priest who'd never met his mother, every dollar felt like dust. Elaine Collins had been the only person who'd ever looked past the quarterly earnings and the magazine covers to see the boy who used to help her count pennies for grocery money. She'd been his compass when ambition threatened to make him cruel, his anchor when success made him arrogant. Now she was gone, and Matthew felt unmoored in a way no amount of money could fix. The funeral director's voice droned on about eternal rest and cherished memories, words that washed over Matthew like white noise. His hazel eyes, the unusual golden-brown shade Elaine had always called God's signature on our family, scanned the crowd without really seeing. Business partners in their grieving appropriate expressions. Society wives who'd never spoken to his mother when she was alive. Distant cousins suddenly remembering their connection now that the will would be read. The predictable theater of mourning the wealthy. Then he saw her. Danielle Brooks stood near the back in trance, partially obscured by the carved oak archway. Her presence so unexpected that Matthew's mind struggled to process it. She wore black, elegant and understated, her dark hair pulled back in a way that highlighted the graceful line of her neck. She looked exactly as he remembered and nothing like he remembered, somehow more beautiful for the 5 years that had passed, more substantial, as if she'd grown into a version of herself that didn't need him anymore. But it wasn't Danielle's unexpected appearance that made his lungs forget how to work. It was the 3 small hands she held. 3 little girls, identical in their black dresses and white ribbons, stood in a perfect row beside Danielle like a secret finally spoken aloud. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old, their faces solemn as they peered around the vast cathedral with the cautious wonder of children in an unfamiliar place. Their dark curls caught the filtered light from the stained glass. Their small fingers gripped their mother's hands tightly. And their eyes, God, their eyes. Hazel. The exact impossible shade that Matthew saw in every family photo, every mirror, every genetic test that had confirmed what his mother always told him. These eyes skip generations, baby. They're rare. They're ours. The funeral director's voice disappeared into static. The cathedral walls seemed to pulse and breathe. 5 years collapsed into 5 seconds as Matthew's mind raced through the math, the memories, the last conversation he'd had with Danielle before she vanished from his life without a trace. Not 3 children. His 3 children. Danielle's face went pale the moment their eyes met across the sea of mourners. She'd known he'd be here, of course she had, but the look on her face said she'd hoped to remain invisible, to pay respects to the woman who'd once been kind to her and slip away before the past caught up. But it was too late. Matthew had seen the truth written in 3 small faces, in 6 hazel eyes that made denial impossible. And now everything, his grief, his guilt, his carefully constructed life, shattered and rearranged itself around a single devastating realization. He had daughters. 3 of them. And he'd missed everything. 5 years earlier, Matthew Collins had been a different man, or perhaps the same man who simply hadn't yet learned what his choices would cost him. He'd been 30, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with proving he belonged in rooms his mother had once cleaned. The Collins name meant something now, but Matthew still carried the chip on his shoulder like a badge of honor, still felt the need to dominate every negotiation, win every deal, prove to his late-arriving father Harold that the son he'd barely acknowledged for 18 years was worth the inheritance he'd finally, begrudgingly shared. The charity gala had been another performance. The Waldorf Astoria ballroom dripped with wealth. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, women in gowns that cost more than his mother's monthly rent. Matthew had written a 6-figure check for childhood literacy, not because he cared but because Harold had told him it was good optics for a man building a public profile. Then Danielle Brooks walked past his table, and the performance stopped mattering. She'd been working the event, not attending it. Part of the nonprofit's coordination team, elegant in a simple black dress that somehow outshone every designer gown in the room. Matthew watched her direct caterers with quiet authority, solve a seating crisis with grace, calm a donor's wife with a smile that seemed to actually mean something. She moved through the gilded chaos like she belonged to a different species than the peacocking elite around her. Someone who did things because they mattered, not because they impressed. He'd approached her during a rare moment when she'd stopped moving, standing near the terrace doors with a glass of water and exhaustion around her eyes. "You're the only person here who looks like they're actually working," Matthew had said. She'd turned those dark eyes on him, assessing. "And you're the only person under 40 who's not on their phone. So we're both anomalies." The conversation that followed had lasted 3 hours. They'd talked through dinner, through the auction, through the orchestral performance neither of them watched. Danielle was sharp and funny and entirely unimpressed by his resume, which made Matthew want to impress her more. She worked in education policy, believed in systemic change, spoke about her students in Detroit with the kind of passion Matthew usually reserved for profit margins. When he'd asked for her number, she'd hesitated. "I don't date men who write checks to feel better about having money," she'd said. "Good thing I write checks because my father tells me to," Matthew had replied. "I don't feel better about anything." She'd laughed then, surprised and genuine, and written her number on a cocktail napkin. The months that followed had been the most real thing in Matthew's carefully constructed life. Danielle didn't fit into his world, didn't want to, which was precisely what he loved about her. She challenged every assumption he'd built his identity on. When he complained about a deal falling through, she reminded him that her students' parents were working 3 jobs. When he stressed about a Forbes interview, she dragged him to a community center fundraiser where the entire annual budget was less than he spent on his car. She made him feel like the man his mother had raised, not the one his father was molding. But Harold Collins noticed. "She's lovely, I'm sure," his father had said over scotch in his study, 6 months into the relationship. "But Matthew, you're building a legacy. The woman beside you becomes part of that brand. Danielle is, well, she's admirable. But she's not strategic." "I'm not dating a marketing strategy," Matthew had shot back. "No. You're dating a distraction from building what we've worked for." The poisoned seed was planted. Harold was subtle. He always was. A comment here about family expectations. A story there about business partnerships destroyed by mismatched marriages. He never forbade anything. He simply made Matthew feel like loving Danielle was choosing failure over legacy, like he'd be disappointing his mother's sacrifices if he didn't marry someone who elevated the Collins name. Matthew had started pulling away without realizing it. Working later. Missing dinners. Creating distance he told himself was temporary, just until he proved himself enough that his choices wouldn't matter. Then Danielle called him one Thursday evening, her voice trembling in a way he'd never heard. "I need to see you," she'd said. "Tonight. It's important." They'd met at her apartment, a modest one-bedroom in Brooklyn that Matthew had once found charming but now, poisoned by his father's words, seemed to highlight everything she wasn't. Danielle had been sitting on her couch, hands folded in her lap, looking small and scared and heartbreakingly hopeful. "I'm pregnant," she'd said simply. "About 6 weeks. I know this isn't planned, and I know your life is complicated, but Matthew, I think we could do this. Together. I think we could be amazing." The hope in her voice had been the worst part. Matthew's first feeling hadn't been joy or fear. It had been panic. Cold, drowning panic. He'd thought of Harold's warnings, of board meetings and investor expectations, of the life he'd built brick by careful brick. He'd thought of his father's disappointment, of being trapped, of losing everything he'd worked for. He hadn't thought about Danielle at all. "It's not the right time," he'd heard himself say, the words hollow and borrowed. "I'm not. We're not ready for this. I'm not ready for this." Danielle's face had done something terrible. Closed like a door, hope dying in real time. "I see," she'd whispered. "I'm ready. But you're not. And I won't beg someone to want their own child." He'd tried to backtrack, to explain, to ask for time to think. But Danielle had simply stood, opened her apartment door, and waited for him to leave. "Goodbye, Matthew," she'd said, and he'd been too much of a coward to recognize it as permanent. She'd disappeared within the week. Changed her number. Left her job. Vanished so completely that Matthew's attempts to find her, half-hearted, guilty, too late, found nothing but dead ends. What Matthew hadn't known, what he wouldn't discover until after his mother's death, was that Elaine Collins had received a letter 2 months after Danielle vanished. A short note explaining everything, asking for nothing, simply letting her know she'd be a grandmother. Elaine, heartbroken by her son's cowardice but devoted to the grandchildren he'd rejected, had written back, had sent gifts to a P.O. box, had kept Danielle's secret for 5 years, hoping Matthew would grow into the man he should have been. She'd died still hoping. And now, standing in the cathedral where his past and present collided, Matthew finally understood the cost of the choice he'd made. 3 daughters. 5 years. All of it gone because he'd been too afraid to disappoint a father who'd never truly loved him anyway. The reception hall emptied slowly, mourners trickling away with relieved expressions of duty fulfilled. Matthew stood near the window overlooking the garden where his mother had once tended roses, the envelope in his hands feeling heavier than paper should. His name was written across the front in Elaine's careful script, the handwriting shakier than he remembered but unmistakably hers. The funeral director had pressed it into his palm after the service with apologetic solemnity. "She left specific instructions that you were to read this alone after." Matthew's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. "My dearest Matthew, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're standing in some room feeling alone in a way money can't fix. I know you, baby. I know how you carry grief, quietly, like it's another business problem to solve. But this letter isn't about grief. It's about choice. I've known about your daughters for 5 years. Ava, Chloe, and Ella. My granddaughters, the little girls with our family's eyes who I've never been allowed to hold because of choices you made and secrets I kept to protect them." Matthew's breath caught. The words blurred. "Danielle wrote to me after she left. She didn't ask for money or help. Just wanted me to know I'd be a grandmother, in case I wanted to care. Of course I wanted to care. I sent what I could without you knowing. Letters. Small gifts. Love from a distance because my son was too afraid to love them up close. I don't write this to shame you, Matthew. I write it because you're standing at the same crossroads your father stood at 30 years ago, and I watched him choose pride over people every single time. He chose reputation over relationship, legacy over love. He died rich and empty, and I don't want that for you. You're going to see Danielle today. She'll be there with the girls because I asked her to come. I wanted you to see what you've been missing. I wanted you to face the cost of your fear. You have a choice now, baby. You can let them walk away again. Protect yourself from the messy, terrifying work of being a father. Or you can do what I raised you to do. What you've always been capable of when you stopped listening to Harold's ghost in your head. You can show up. Not with money. Not with grand gestures. Just with presence. Consistency. The willingness to be uncomfortable and imperfect and there anyway. Those 3 little girls didn't ask to be born into your complications. They deserve better than a father who only loves them when it's convenient. And Danielle, God, that woman loved you so completely, and you broke her heart because you were more afraid of disappointing a man who never truly saw you than losing a woman who did. I can't tell you what to do anymore. But I can tell you this. Don't repeat your father's mistakes. Don't choose the legacy over the love. Don't wait until it's too late and you're writing letters from the grave, begging your children to be braver than you were. Be the man I know you can be, Matthew. The one who helped me count pennies and promised to make something of himself. You made the money, baby. Now make the life. I love you. I forgive you. Now go earn their forgiveness. Mom. Matthew's hands shook so violently the letter nearly slipped from his fingers. His vision swam. His chest felt crushed beneath a weight he hadn't known he was carrying until it doubled. She'd known. 4 or 5 years, his mother had known, had loved grandchildren in secret, had carried his failure like her own burden. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, forcing back the breakdown that threatened. Not here. Not yet. When he looked up, he saw through the window, Danielle in the parking lot, crouched between the 3 girls, adjusting their coats with efficient maternal movements. She was leaving. Of course she was leaving. Matthew moved without thinking. He crossed the reception hall, pushed through the heavy doors, and emerged into the late afternoon chill just as Danielle was opening the car door. Wait. His voice came out rougher than intended. Please. Just wait. Danielle froze, her hand on the door handle. The girls looked up at him with identical expressions of curiosity and caution. She straightened slowly, positioning herself subtly between Matthew and the children. Matthew. His name in her mouth after 5 years sounded like a stranger's. I'm sorry. The words tumbled out inadequate and true. I know that means nothing. I know I have no right to ask you to stay, but He looked down at the 3 small faces watching him. I need to know their names. Please. Danielle's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes. Pain, maybe. Or the memory of pain. Ava, she said quietly, touching the shoulder of the girl on the left. Chloe, the middle child. And Ella, the smallest, half hidden behind her sisters. Ava, Chloe, Ella. Matthew repeated the names like an incantation, committing them to memory. His daughters. His. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to their eye level. Up close, the resemblance was staggering. Not just the hazel eyes, but the shape of Chloe's chin, the arch of Ava's eyebrows, the way Ella tilted her head exactly like he did when uncertain. Hi, he said softly, unsure of everything except that this moment mattered more than any negotiation he'd ever navigated. 3 small voices whispered back. Hi. Ava, the one who seemed oldest by temperament if not minutes, studied him with unsettling directness. Then she asked the question that shattered what remained of Matthew's carefully constructed defenses. "Are you our daddy?" The parking lot went silent except for distant traffic and Matthew's ragged breathing. He looked up at Danielle, helpless, seeking permission he hadn't earned. Her face was stone, but her eyes were storm. Matthew's voice cracked. "I'd like to be. If that's okay." "Our mommy says our daddy was busy," Chloe offered, matter of fact. "Are you not busy anymore?" The innocence of it destroyed him. "No," Matthew whispered. Yes. I was wrong to be busy. I should have been there. I'm so sorry." Danielle's hand touched Ava's shoulder, gentle but firm. "Girls, wait in the car for a minute. Mommy needs to talk to Mr. Collins." When the car doors closed, Danielle turned to Matthew with an expression that held 5 years of survival. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice low and steady. "Those girls are not a second chance for you to feel better about your choices. They're not here to absolve your guilt or fill whatever's missing in your life now that your mother's gone. If you want to know them, really know them, you come in with both feet. No half measures. No when it's convenient. No running when it gets hard or complicated or your father's ghost tells you they're not strategic." Matthew nodded, throat too tight for words. "They've asked about you," Danielle continued, and her voice finally wavered. "For 3 years, they've asked why they don't have a daddy like other kids. And I have never, not once, told them you didn't want them. But Matthew, if you do this, if you walk into their lives, you don't get to leave again. Because I will survive you breaking my heart twice. They won't." "I understand," Matthew managed. "Do you?" Danielle's eyes searched his face. "Because understanding and doing are different things. And those girls deserve someone who does, not someone who understands." "Teach me," Matthew said. "Please. I'll show up every day. I'll do whatever it takes. Just give me the chance to do this right." Danielle studied him for a long moment, and Matthew saw her making calculations he couldn't follow, weighing risks he'd created. Finally, she pulled a card from her purse and handed it to him. "We'll start slowly," she said. "For their sake, not yours." Matthew took the card like a lifeline, her number and address written in the same handwriting that used to leave notes on his bathroom mirror. "Thank you," he whispered. Danielle didn't respond. She simply returned to the car where 3 hazel-eyed girls pressed their faces against the window, watching their mother and the stranger who might become their father. As they drove away, Matthew clutched the card in one hand and his mother's letter in the other. 2 pieces of paper that weighed more than everything he'd ever built. Matthew sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, the Manhattan skyline spread before him like a conquered kingdom, and couldn't remember a single word from the acquisition meeting he'd apparently just led. "Sir." His CFO's voice pulled him back. "Did you want to review the Singapore terms before we proceed?" Matthew looked down at the contract in front of him. 7 figures, a deal he'd been negotiating for 3 months, and felt nothing. The numbers blurred into shapes. The shapes became hazel eyes. 3 pairs of them, watching him with curiosity and caution. "Are you our daddy?" "Matthew." The CFO tried again. "Push it to next week," Matthew heard himself say. "I need. Reschedule everything. Cancel today." The room went silent. Matthew Collins didn't cancel. Didn't reschedule. Didn't lose focus during negotiations that could make or break quarterly projections. But Matthew Collins also apparently had 3 daughters he'd never held, and suddenly Singapore felt as distant and irrelevant as the moon. After the room cleared with confused, backward glances, Henry Chen remained. Matthew's best friend since college, now his personal assistant and the only person in his empire who was allowed to tell him the truth. Henry leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "You look like hell," Henry observed. "I have children." The words came out hollow. 3 of them. 5 years old. I saw them yesterday at the funeral. Henry's expression shifted from concern to shock. What? Matthew told him everything. Danielle. The pregnancy. His cowardice. His mother's secret correspondence. The girls in the parking lot with eyes that convicted him without a single word of accusation. When he finished, Henry was quiet for a long moment. Triplets, Henry finally said. You had triplets with Danielle Brooks and you. Jesus. Matthew. What are you going to do? I don't know. Matthew's hand shook. I can't focus. I can't think about anything else. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Ava's direct stare. Chloe's matter-of-fact question about whether I was still too busy. Ella hiding behind her sisters like she already knows I'm someone who leaves. So don't be, Henry said simply. Don't be someone who leaves. It's not that simple. It actually is. Henry moved into the office, closing the door behind him. Look, I've watched you negotiate impossible deals, turn failing companies profitable, outthink every competitor who underestimated you. You've never walked away from a challenge because it was hard. Don't start now just because this one involves actual feelings. Matthew looked at his best friend. What if I can't do this? What if I'm like Harold, incapable of being what they need? Harold was never haunted by his choices, Henry said firmly. You're sitting here looking like a ghost yourself because you finally understand what you lost. That's the difference. Harold didn't care. You do. So prove it. Show up. Do the work. Make this right. The words settled over Matthew like a challenge he didn't know how to accept but couldn't refuse. She gave me her address, he said quietly, pulling Danielle's card from his pocket. I don't know what to do with it. You go there, Henry said. That's what you do with it. Across the city in a modest Brooklyn apartment, Danielle Brooks sat on the floor surrounded by the aftermath of dinner. Plastic plates with dinosaurs on them, sippy cups, a battlefield of chicken nuggets and negotiation. Mommy, Ava said, her serious little face tilted in that way that meant difficult questions were coming. Is that man really our daddy? Danielle's hands stilled over the plate she'd been clearing. Chloe and Ella looked up from their coloring books, suddenly attentive. Yes, Danielle said carefully. That's Matthew. He's your father. Why doesn't he live with us? Chloe asked. The question was innocent, inevitable, and it cut through Danielle like glass. It's complicated, baby, Danielle said. The inadequate answer every parent defaults to when the truth is too heavy for small shoulders. Did he leave because of us? Ella's voice was small, worried. No. Danielle pulled Ella into her lap immediately, fierce and protective. No, sweetheart. It was never about you. He didn't even know about you. Will he come back? Ava pressed. Or will he be busy again? Danielle's throat tightened. She looked at her daughters, these 3 perfect, complicated miracles she'd raised alone through sleepless nights and financial terror and moments of joy so pure it hurt. They deserved better than half-truths and carefully worded non-answers. I don't know, she admitted. He says he wants to know you. But wanting and doing are different things. You always say doing is what matters, Chloe said, repeating Danielle's own wisdom back to her. I do say that, don't I? Danielle managed to smile. Later, after the girls were asleep in the bedroom they shared, 3 twin beds crammed into a space meant for one, decorated with handmade decorations and thrift store finds, Danielle stood in her kitchen and let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. She thought of Elaine Collins, the elegant woman who'd sent birthday cards addressed to my precious granddaughters, and small checks with notes that said for something special, just because. Elaine, who'd loved them from a distance because her son was too afraid to love them up close. The funeral had been Danielle's way of honoring that quiet, secret kindness. She'd never intended to let Matthew see the girls. Never planned for Ava to ask her devastating question or for Matthew to look at his daughters like a man confronting the cost of his choices. Now the door she'd closed 5 years ago had cracked open, and Danielle didn't know whether to guard it or let it swing wide. Because the girls were already hoping, already asking, already imagining a father who might show up and stay. And if Matthew broke their hearts the way he'd broken hers. The knock on the door startled her from the spiral of worry. Danielle checked the peephole and her breath caught. Matthew stood in the hallway of her rent-controlled building, looking catastrophically out of place in his tailored suit amid the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. He held something in his hands, a bag from a bookstore, wrinkled like he'd been gripping it too tightly. Danielle opened the door but didn't invite him in. "You said to start slowly," Matthew said without preamble. "I didn't know what slowly meant, so I came. I should have called. I'm sorry. I can leave if—" "Why are you here, Matthew?" Danielle interrupted, too tired for polite pretense. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something raw and unfamiliar in his face. "Because I can't stop seeing them," he said. "Their faces. Their eyes. Because I've spent 3 days trying to focus on anything else and I can't. Because my best friend told me to stop being a coward and show up. Because—" his voice cracked. "Because they asked if I was their daddy and I want to be able to say yes and mean it." Danielle studied him. This man who'd once been everything to her and then nothing. He looked exhausted, uncertain, nothing like the controlled, calculating Matthew Collins who'd told her it wasn't the right time. "This is where we live," she said quietly, gesturing to the narrow hallway, the apartment behind her with its second-hand furniture and crayon marks on the walls. "This is my world. It's nothing like yours." "I don't care about that," Matthew said. "You should. Because if you walk in here, you're walking into their lives. And I meant what I said, no half measures." Matthew nodded. "Both feet. Every day. I remember." Danielle hesitated, then stepped aside. "They're asleep," she said. "But you can come in. We can talk." Matthew entered the apartment like a man crossing a threshold he knew he didn't deserve to cross, and Danielle closed the door behind them both, wondering if she was making space for healing or just opening old wounds in front of witnesses too young to protect themselves from the bleeding. The first Saturday, Matthew arrived at 9 in the morning with a bookstore bag he'd brought days earlier and a nervousness he hadn't felt since his first board presentation. Danielle answered the door in jeans and an old sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, looking more beautiful than she had any right to be without trying. Behind her, 3 small faces peered around her legs with expressions ranging from curious to cautious. "You came," Ava said, as if she'd been testing a hypothesis. "I said I would," Matthew replied and knelt down to their eye level, a position he was learning mattered. "I brought books. If that's okay." He'd spent 2 hours in the children's section, overwhelmed and determined, finally asking the bemused clerk for help selecting age-appropriate stories for 5-year-old girls he was trying to know. Chloe stepped forward first, drawn by curiosity. "What kind of books?" "All kinds. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I may have bought too many." He had. Danielle's expression when he pulled 12 picture books from the bag was somewhere between exasperation and something softer she quickly hid. They read on the living room floor, Matthew's expensive suit wrinkling against the worn carpet while 3 little girls pressed against his sides, smelling like strawberry shampoo and childhood. Chloe asked questions about every illustration. Why is the caterpillar hungry? Where does he live? What happens to butterflies in winter? Her mind constantly reaching for the mechanics behind the magic. Matthew recognized the hunger for understanding. He'd been the same way, taking apart his mother's radio at 6 just to see how sound worked. "You think like an engineer," he told Chloe, and she beamed like he'd given her treasure. Ava directed which books they'd read in which order, negotiating with her sisters with the diplomatic precision of someone managing personalities and keeping peace. When Ella wanted to read the same story twice and Chloe protested, Ava proposed they read it once now and once before bed, a compromise that satisfied both parties. Matthew watched her orchestrate the agreement and saw himself in every boardroom, finding the solution that made everyone feel heard. "You're a natural leader," he said quietly, and Ava looked at him with those devastating hazel eyes and nodded seriously, as if she already knew. Ella was quietest, most hesitant. She didn't ask questions or negotiate. She simply drifted into imaginative tangents, turning the story about a lost bunny into an elaborate narrative about a bunny kingdom with its own language and customs and a neighboring society of wise owls. The owls can see in the dark, so they help the bunnies find their way home, Ella explained with absolute conviction in her imagined world. Matthew, who'd spent his whole life dealing in concrete metrics and quantifiable results, found himself enchanted by the way her mind transformed simple stories into sprawling mythology. "You see things other people don't," he told her. "That's a gift." Ella smiled shyly and tucked herself closer against his side. Danielle watched from the kitchen doorway, her coffee mug held like a shield, her expression unreadable. The girls warmed slowly over the following weeks. Matthew came every Saturday, then Saturdays and Wednesdays. He learned their routines, their preferences, the way Chloe needed facts before trying new foods, how Ava required fairness in all things, how Ella needed time to warm up to transitions. He was terrible at braiding hair and burned the grilled cheese sandwiches and had no idea how to negotiate the complex politics of princess movies. But he showed up. Consistently. Both feet in, just like he'd promised. But Danielle remained distant, supervising from the margins, never quite letting her guard down. One evening after the girls were asleep, Matthew found her washing dishes in the small kitchen, her shoulders tight with tension he'd caused and couldn't fix with apologies alone. "Can we talk?" he asked. "We've been talking," Danielle said without turning around. "You've been very good at small talk between story time and snack negotiations." "That's not what I mean." She turned then, leaning against the counter, and the weight of 5 years stood between them like a third presence. "What do you want me to say, Matthew? That it's fine? That you're doing great? You want me to absolve you?" "I want to know if this is working," Matthew said carefully. "If you think I can actually do this." "The girls love the attention," Danielle said. "They talk about you constantly. You're already becoming essential to them, which terrifies me." "And you?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Danielle's expression shuddered. "This isn't about me." "Isn't it? We're going to co-parent for the rest of our lives. We need to figure out how to exist in the same space without." He gestured helplessly at the tension humming between them. "Without what? Without remembering that you chose your father's approval over our family? Without remembering that I begged you to want your own children and you said it wasn't the right time?" Her voice remained quiet, controlled, but the pain underneath was molten. Matthew absorbed the hit. "I deserve that." "You deserve worse than that," Danielle said. "But I won't give it to you because the girls are listening even when we think they're not, and I won't make them choose sides in something that was never their fault." "I know I failed you," Matthew said. "I know I can't fix that. But I need to know, is this guilt I'm feeling, or is this love? Because I can't tell anymore. I look at them and my chest hurts. I think about the 5 years I missed and I can't breathe. Is that guilt or is that?" "It's both," Danielle interrupted. "And you don't get clarity on that yet. You earn it. You show up for years, not weeks, and maybe eventually you'll know the difference." She dried her hands and moved past him toward the bedroom, then paused. "They're not a cure for your regret, Matthew. They're people. Whole, complicated people who deserve a father who loves them for who they are, not because being absent destroyed you." She left him standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the domestic debris of a life he could have had. Late that night, alone in his penthouse that felt cavernous and cold, Matthew did something he'd avoided for 5 years. He opened his old messages from Danielle. They were still there, archived but not deleted, a digital graveyard of a relationship he'd killed through cowardice. Pictures of the two of them at the lake house, laughing. Screenshots of apartments she'd wanted to see together. Messages that read, "Missing you and can't wait to see you, and I think I'm falling in love with you." Then the gap. The silence after he'd said it wasn't the right time. And one final voicemail, left 3 weeks after she'd disappeared. Matthew had never listened to it. Had been too afraid, too ashamed, too desperate to move forward by pretending the past didn't exist. Now he pressed play. Danielle's voice filled the empty room, soft and tired and heartbreakingly sad. "Matthew, it's me. I know you probably won't listen to this. I know you've made your choice. But I'm lying here feeling them move, all 3 of them. The doctor confirmed it's triplets, and I needed to say this once." A pause. Matthew's hand shook. "We would have made great parents. I really believe that. I still do, even though I'll be doing it alone. I'm not calling to change your mind. I'm calling to let you know I forgive you for being afraid. I just wish you'd been brave enough to be afraid with me instead of running away from it." Another pause. Longer. He could hear her breathing, gathering courage. "I loved you. Past tense, because I can't afford present tense anymore. But I did. Completely. And our daughters will know they were made from that, even if they never know you. Goodbye, Matthew. I hope you find whatever it was worth more than us." The voicemail ended. Matthew sat in the dark, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding the full weight of what he'd destroyed and what he was desperately, impossibly trying to rebuild from the ruins. Harold Collins returned from Monaco on a Tuesday, tanned and imperious, sweeping into Matthew's office without knocking. A power move he'd perfected decades ago and never retired. "We need to discuss your recent distraction," Harold said, settling into the chair across from Matthew's desk as if he owned it. He did, technically. The Collins family trust still held controlling interest in Matthew's ventures, a fact Harold wielded like a weapon whenever his son showed signs of independent thought. Matthew looked up from the contract he'd been reviewing, a partnership agreement he was structuring to ensure Danielle had financial security regardless of what happened between them. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Don't insult my intelligence." Harold's voice went cold. "You've been disappearing twice a week. Missing investor meetings. Your assistant told me you've blocked out personal time on your calendar. So I made calls. Had someone look into what could possibly be more important than the empire we've built." The way he said we made Matthew's jaw tighten. Harold had contributed capital and connections. Matthew had contributed everything else. The vision, the work, the sleepless nights turning possibilities into profit. "And?" Matthew asked, his voice dangerously quiet. 3 illegitimate children with some non-profit worker you were slumming with years ago." Harold delivered it like a prosecutor presenting damning evidence. "Triplets, apparently. 5 years old. Which means they were conceived right around the time I explicitly warned you that woman was a liability." "Her name is Danielle," Matthew said. "And those children are your granddaughters." Harold's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Those children are a PR disaster waiting to happen. A man of your position, with secret illegitimate triplets? Do you understand what that does to your credibility? Your brand? They're not illegitimate. They're mine. I'm their father." You're a Collins, Harold corrected. And Collins men don't get trapped by mistakes. We certainly don't legitimize them publicly and destroy everything we've built for some misguided, guilt-driven redemption arc. Matthew stood slowly, his hands flat on the desk. They're not mistakes. They're children. My children. And I've already wasted 5 years of their lives because I was stupid enough to listen to you once before. And you're about to waste your entire future by listening to sentiment instead of strategy. Harold leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen. You will quietly provide financial support if you must. A trust fund, handled through lawyers, kept private. You will not acknowledge them publicly. You will certainly not parade them around as legitimate heirs. And you will absolutely not continue this little domestic fantasy with their mother. I'm not negotiating this with you. Yes, you are. Harold's voice turned to ice. Because if you legitimize the situation, if you acknowledge these children publicly or, God forbid, marry that woman, I will invoke the morality clause in the family trust. You'll lose your stake in Collins Holdings, your board positions, your access to the family capital that funds your ventures. I'll cut you off completely and ensure every investor in Manhattan knows you're a liability. The threat hung in the air like poison. Matthew heard the door to his office open quietly behind him. His assistant bringing the coffee he'd requested, but Harold was too focused on his ultimatum to notice. So you have a choice, Matthew. The empire we've built, or 3 children who will do nothing but anchor you to mediocrity. Choose wisely. I already chose them, Matthew said. He turned and saw, not his assistant, but Danielle, frozen in the doorway with 2 coffees in her hands and devastation on her face. She'd come to surprise him, to thank him for the partnership agreement his assistant had accidentally mentioned, to maybe, possibly, talk about lowering some of her walls. Instead, she'd walked into Harold Collins threatening to destroy Matthew's life because her daughters existed. Danielle, Matthew started. But she was already backing away, setting the coffees down on the nearest surface with shaking hands. I should go, she said, her voice carefully empty. Ms. Brooks, I presume, Harold said, standing with the predatory courtesy of a shark acknowledging prey. How convenient. Now we can all discuss this rationally. There's nothing to discuss, Danielle said, looking at Matthew with eyes that held too much pain and too much recognition. This was a mistake. I never should have. Don't, Matthew said, moving toward her. Don't run. Not because of him. I'm not running from him, Danielle said quietly. I'm protecting my daughters from this. From men who call them disasters and mistakes. From a world that will always see them as anchors and liabilities. They're not. I heard what he said, Matthew. All of it. Her voice cracked. And I've seen this before. 5 years ago you chose his approval over us. Now he's making you choose again, except this time the stakes are your entire life. Your empire. Everything you've worked for. I don't care about. You should care. Danielle's composure shattered. Because what happens when you choose us and lose everything and 5 years from now you resent us for it? When you look at your daughters and see everything you sacrificed instead of everything you gained? That won't happen. You don't know that, Danielle said. And I won't let my girls grow up watching their father slowly hate the choice he made. She left before Matthew could stop her, her footsteps echoing down the hall like a door closing. Harold watched her go with satisfaction. Well, that solved itself rather neatly. Something in Matthew broke then. Not the dramatic shattering of glass but the quiet, irreversible breaking of a foundation that could never be repaired. He turned to his father slowly. Get out, Matthew said. Excuse me. Get out of my office. Out of my company. Out of my life. Harold's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. No, Matthew said. I made a mistake 5 years ago when I let you convince me that love was weakness and family was a brand liability. I made a mistake every day after that when I let you live in my head telling me what mattered. But I'm done making that mistake. I'm your father. You're a man who taught me to value everything that doesn't matter and destroy everything that does." Matthew's voice was steel. "My mother knew it. That's why she kept my daughters a secret from you. Not from me, from you. Because she knew you'd do exactly this. Turn them into problems to solve instead of people to love. Matthew, think about what you're throwing away." "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing what to keep." Matthew pulled the family trust documents from his desk drawer, the ones that had governed his life for a decade. "You want to invoke the morality clause? Do it. Take the money. Take the board seats. Take whatever pieces of Collins Holdings you think define us." He signed his name across the resignation paperwork he'd had drawn up weeks ago, when some part of him had known this confrontation was inevitable. "I'll build something new. Something that isn't tainted by your values or controlled by your threats. And when my daughters ask me what kind of man their father is, I'll be able to say I'm the kind who chose them. Every single time." Harold's face went purple with rage. "You'll regret this." "The only thing I regret," Matthew said, "is that it took me 5 years and losing the woman I loved to finally stop being you." He held the door open. Harold left without another word, his expensive shoes clicking against marble in a rhythm that sounded like the end of something Matthew should have ended years ago. When the office door closed, Matthew stood alone in the silence, his hands shaking, his empire crumbling, his future uncertain. But for the first time in 5 years, he felt like he could breathe. Now he just had to convince Danielle that this time, this choice was real. Convincing Danielle to give him another chance after the confrontation with Harold took 3 weeks of showing up at her door with proof. Not flowers or grand gestures, but documents. The signed resignation from Collins Holdings. The new LLC papers for an independent venture capital firm with his name alone. The severed trust fund agreements. Evidence that he'd chosen them before asking them to choose him back. "I need you to believe this isn't temporary," Matthew had said, standing in her doorway while rain soaked through his coat. "I need you to see that I already made the choice. Now I'm just asking for the chance to prove it wasn't just dramatic impulse." Danielle had studied the papers with the careful attention of someone who'd been disappointed before. "The girls ask about you every day," she'd finally said. "They don't understand why you stopped coming." "Then let me come back. Please." She'd let him in. Not all the way, but enough. The first weekend visit was chaos. Matthew arrived Saturday morning prepared for structured activities and found instead the beautiful disorder of children who'd been waiting for him. All 3 girls talked at once, pulling him in different directions. Chloe wanted to show him the science experiment she'd built from toilet paper rolls and tape. Ava needed him to referee a complicated dispute about whose turn it was to pick the movie. Ella had drawn him a picture of what she insisted was his house, though it looked more like a castle with dragon neighbors. "They're friendly dragons," Ella explained seriously. "They help protect the castle." Matthew knelt down to her level, studying the drawing with the same focus he'd once given merger agreements. "Do the dragons have names?" Ella's face lit up, and she launched into an elaborate mythology while Matthew listened like it was the most important briefing he'd ever received. Danielle watched from the kitchen, her expression unreadable but softer than it had been. Bedtime that night was an education in patience Matthew hadn't known he possessed. The girls had routines, specific pajamas, particular songs, an exact order of events that could not be deviated from without consequence. Teeth first, then potty, then stories, then water, then songs, then one more hug. Ava instructed him like a drill sergeant. "That's the rules." Matthew followed orders, stumbling through songs he half remembered, reading the same story 3 times because Ella wasn't ready to let it end, negotiating with Chloe about why they couldn't do a science experiment about whether darkness was the absence of light or its own substance at 8:30 at night. "Tomorrow," he promised. "We'll experiment with light tomorrow." When they were finally settled, Matthew collapsed on Danielle's couch feeling like he'd run a marathon. "You survived," Danielle said, handing him water with something almost like amusement in her eyes. "Is it always like that? Every single night for 5 years?" The words weren't accusatory, just factual. A reminder of everything she'd done alone. "I'm sorry," Matthew said quietly. "I know I keep saying it, but—" "Then stop saying it and keep showing up," Danielle interrupted. "Words are cheap. This," she gestured toward the bedroom where 3 little girls were finally sleeping. "This is what matters." So Matthew showed up. Weeks turned into months. Matthew learned the rhythm of their lives, the way Chloe needed explanations for everything, how Ava required advance warning before transitions, how Ella's imagination needed space to unfold without being corrected into reality. He learned that macaroni and cheese had to be the shaped kind, not the shells. That Ava's blue cup was non-negotiable. That Ella needed her stuffed rabbit positioned exactly right or she couldn't sleep. That Chloe asked 14 questions before breakfast and 20 more by lunch. He learned patience he'd never needed in boardrooms, humility he'd never found in success. And somewhere in the chaos of park visits and cartoon negotiations and helping with homework that shouldn't be this complicated for kindergartners, the girls stopped calling him Matthew. It happened on a random Tuesday. Matthew was helping Chloe build a model volcano when Ella wandered over with her coloring book. "Daddy, can you help me color this rainbow? I can't reach the purple." The room went silent. Ella didn't seem to notice she'd said anything monumental. She just stood there waiting, holding out her coloring book with complete trust that he'd help with the purple. Matthew's vision blurred. His throat closed. He managed to nod and take the crayon with shaking hands. Ava looked up from her book. "Daddy, when you're done with Ella's rainbow, can you quiz me on my spelling words?" Chloe, matter-of-fact as ever. "We have 3 daddies now. 1 for each of us." "That's fair." Matthew excused himself to the bathroom and cried for the first time since his mother's funeral. Not from grief, but from overwhelming gratitude for a gift he didn't deserve and would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. When he emerged, Danielle was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "They love you," she said quietly. "Don't make me regret letting them." "I won't," Matthew promised. "I swear I won't." The turning point came on an ordinary Thursday. Matthew was in a meeting with potential investors when his phone rang with Danielle's number. He'd told her to call any time for anything, but she never had. His stomach dropped. "I'm sorry to bother you," Danielle said, her voice tight with controlled worry. "But the school called. Ava's sick. High fever, they think it might be flu. I'm stuck in a parent-teacher conference for Chloe across town and can't get there for another 40 minutes. And Ava's scared and—" "I'm going," Matthew said, already standing. "Text me the school address. I'll be there in 15 minutes." He was there in 12. The school nurse led him to a small room where Ava lay on a cot, flushed and glassy-eyed, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. When she saw him, her face crumpled. "Daddy," she whispered. "My head hurts." Matthew's heart broke and rebuilt itself in the same moment. "I know, sweetheart. I'm here. I've got you." He gathered her into his arms, her fever-hot little body curling against his chest, and carried her to his car. He drove to the pediatrician Danielle texted him, waited through the examination, filled the prescription, then took Ava back to Danielle's apartment and stayed. He gave her medicine at the right intervals. Kept her hydrated, read stories in a quiet voice when she felt well enough to listen, placed cool cloths on her forehead when the fever spiked. Didn't leave even when Danielle came home and told him he could. "I want to stay," Matthew said simply. "If that's okay." Danielle looked at him for a long moment, at Matthew in his wrinkled dress shirt, sitting on the floor beside Ava's bed, keeping vigil over their daughter like he'd been doing it her whole life instead of just these few months. "Okay," she said softly. That night, after Ava's fever broke and she fell into real sleep, Danielle found Matthew still on the floor, his head resting against the bed frame. "You came," she said quietly. "When I called, you just came." "Of course I came," Matthew said. "She needed me." "Matthew." Danielle's voice was different. Softer, more open than it had been since the funeral. "You could have sent a car service. A nanny. You could have solved it with money from a distance. But you showed up. You've been showing up." "That's what fathers do," Matthew said. "Yes," Danielle agreed, and for the first time in 5 years, she looked at him without walls. "It is." She sat down beside him on the floor, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they kept watch over their daughter together. Not as exes forced into co-parenting, but as something that might eventually become a family. Danielle found the letter while cleaning out the closet she'd been avoiding for 5 years. It was tucked inside a maternity journal she'd kept for 3 months before abandoning. Back when she'd still believed Matthew might come around, might choose them, might become the man she'd thought he was. The envelope was addressed but never stamped, never sent, sealed like a time capsule of hope and heartbreak. She sat on her bedroom floor holding it, remembering the woman who'd written it. Younger, more naive, pregnant with triplets and still foolish enough to believe love could overcome fear. The girls were at a playdate. Matthew was picking them up in an hour, a routine so established now that Danielle had almost stopped bracing for the day he'd disappoint them. Almost. She opened the envelope. Reading it was like watching herself bleed in real time. Every word she'd written 7 months into her pregnancy, desperate and exhausted and still somehow full of love for a man who'd walked away. When Matthew arrived with 3 chattering girls and a bag of art supplies Chloe had apparently convinced him were educationally critical, Danielle met him at the door with the letter in her hand. "I need you to read something," she said quietly. Matthew's expression shifted to concern. "Is everything okay?" "Just read it. Later. When you're alone." She pressed the aged envelope into his hands. "I wrote it 5 years ago. I never sent it. But I think you need to see it anyway." Matthew waited until he was back in his apartment, the sterile penthouse he still lived in but no longer felt like home, before opening the letter. Danielle's handwriting, rounder and less controlled than her current precise script, filled 3 pages. "Matthew, I'm writing this at 2 a.m. because the girls won't stop moving and I can't sleep and I keep thinking about all the things I should have said when you told me it wasn't the right time. You're wrong. There's never a right time for the kind of love that rewrites your life. There's just the choice to be brave or the choice to run, and you chose running. I'm not writing to change your mind. I know you well enough to know that when you make a decision, you commit to it with the same intensity you commit to everything. You decided we were a mistake, and you'll convince yourself of that until it becomes true in your memory. But I need you to know what you're walking away from. 3 babies. Matthew. 3. The doctor showed me the ultrasound and I laughed and cried at the same time because of course it would be triplets. Of course loving you would be this complicated and overwhelming and impossible. They move all the time now. All 3 of them like they're already fighting for space, already developing personalities. I imagine them. One will be stubborn like you, one will be curious, one will be the peacemaker. I'm already in love with people I haven't met, and it's terrifying and beautiful and I wish you were here to feel this with me. Your mother called yesterday. She cried when I told her. Not because she was disappointed, because she was heartbroken you weren't part of this. She said you were scared, and I know she's right. You've always been scared of anything you can't control or quantify or solve with strategy. But love isn't a business deal, Matthew. Family isn't a merger. These babies aren't problems to solve. They're people we made because we loved each other, and that should matter more than your father's approval or your company's optics or whatever excuse you're using to sleep at night. I forgive you for being afraid. I just wish you'd been brave enough to be afraid with me instead of alone. I'll raise them well. I promise you that. They'll know they were wanted, by me, even if not by you. They'll know they were made from love, even if it didn't last. They'll never feel like mistakes, even though you'll probably always think of them that way. And maybe someday when they ask about their father, I'll be able to tell them you were a good man who made a bad choice. Maybe I'll even believe it. I loved you. I think I still do, which makes this hurt more than it should. I hope whatever you chose instead of us is worth it. Danielle. Matthew read it 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. He sat in his empty apartment surrounded by expensive furniture and accomplishments that suddenly looked like exactly what they were. Compensation for the things that actually mattered, the things he'd been too afraid to keep. She'd forgiven him 5 years ago, and he'd never known. Had never been brave enough to find out. He made a phone call. I need to show you something, Matthew said when Danielle answered. Can Henry watch the girls for a few hours? Matthew, what? Please. Trust me. An hour later, they stood in front of a brownstone in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. The kind of street with trees and stoops and the sound of children playing in nearby yards. What is this? Danielle asked. Come inside. Matthew unlocked the door to reveal a house in mid-renovation. Not a showpiece, no marble counters or designer fixtures, but a real home being carefully rebuilt. Hardwood floors refinished. Walls painted in warm, welcoming colors. A kitchen with space for family dinners. A backyard with room for a garden. And upstairs, 3 bedrooms, each one empty but clearly planned. I bought it 2 months ago, Matthew said quietly. I've been working on it in the evenings. The contractor thinks I'm insane for caring about details like whether the bedroom doors open quietly or if the backyard gets good afternoon light for playing. Danielle walked through the rooms, her hand trailing along walls Matthew had probably painted himself. Why? She whispered. Because they deserve their own rooms. Their own space. A yard to play in. Matthew's voice was steady but raw. Because you deserve a home, not a cramped apartment where you've been doing everything alone for 5 years. Matthew. I'm not asking you to live here with me, he said quickly. This isn't some grand gesture with strings attached. The deed is in your name. Yours alone. I had the papers drawn up last week. Danielle turned to stare at him. You're giving me a house? I'm giving my daughters a home. And their mother security. Matthew met her eyes. You don't owe me anything, Danielle. But I owe everything to them. And to you. For raising them. For loving them when I was too much of a coward to. For keeping them safe from my mistakes. His voice cracked. I read your letter. All of it. And you were right. There's never a right time for love that rewrites your life. I was just too scared to let my life be rewritten. Too controlled by a father who taught me legacy mattered more than love. Too afraid of becoming the kind of man who chose family over empire. Matthew, you made me a father 5 years ago, and I rejected the gift because I couldn't see past my own fear. You gave me another chance when you had every right to keep them from me forever. And I will never, ever be able to repay that. But I can give you this. A home. Stability. Proof that I'm not going anywhere. Danielle's eyes filled with tears. I don't need a house to believe you, she said. I know. But I needed to give it anyway. And then Danielle broke. Not with the controlled composure she'd maintained for 5 years. Not with the guarded distance she'd kept between them. She broke completely, sobbing in a way that sounded like 5 years of holding everything together finally finding permission to fall apart. Matthew caught her, and she let him, her face pressed against his chest while he held her like something precious he'd finally learned not to drop. "I was so tired," she whispered between sobs. "So tired of doing it alone. Of being strong. Of pretending it didn't hurt that you didn't want us." "I know," Matthew said, his own tears falling into her hair. "I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." "I see you now," Danielle said, pulling back to look at him with tears streaming down her face. "Finally. I see you showing up. I see you trying. I see you being the man I thought you were 5 years ago." "I'm going to keep showing up," Matthew promised. "For the rest of my life. Whether you forgive me or not. Whether you ever want me as more than their father or not. I'm going to be here." Danielle nodded, something shifting in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of letting go of the pain she'd carried alone. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." They stood in the empty house Matthew had built for a family he was still earning the right to be part of, holding each other while 5 years of grief and regret and hope finally found space to breathe. The backyard of the brownstone, their brownstone now, though Danielle still looked surprised every time she said it, was transformed into controlled chaos. Balloons in purple, teal, and yellow, each girl had chosen her own color, naturally, bobbed against the fence. A table groaned under the weight of pizza, fruit, and a cake decorated with 6 candles and an alarming amount of buttercream frosting. Children from the girls' kindergarten class ran shrieking through the garden Matthew had spent 3 months cultivating, and he found he didn't care that they were trampling his carefully planned flower beds. Ava directed traffic with the authority of an event coordinator, ensuring every guest knew where the games were and that everyone followed the schedule she'd written on construction paper. Chloe had turned the gift table into an impromptu science demonstration, explaining to anyone who'd listen about the physics of balloon inflation. Ella floated between groups, weaving stories about the birthday fairies who'd helped decorate, her imagination turning a backyard party into an enchanted celebration. Matthew stood near the grill, nominally supervising hot dogs, actually just watching his daughters own their 6th year of life with the kind of joy he'd missed for 5 of them. "You're doing the thing again," Danielle said, appearing beside him with a tray of lemonade. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at them like you're trying to memorize every second because you're afraid it might disappear." Matthew smiled, caught. "Can you blame me?" "No," Danielle said softly. "But they're not going anywhere. You can relax." He helped her set out the drinks, their movements synchronized in a way that had developed over the past year. Not the passionate choreography of their early romance, but something steadier. Partnership built on showing up, on shared responsibility, on 3 little girls who needed both of them. They'd moved into the brownstone 4 months ago. Separate bedrooms, careful boundaries, but a shared life nonetheless. Co-parenting that had slowly, carefully, become coexisting. Matthew had his room on the 3rd floor. The girls had their own rooms on the 2nd. Danielle had the main bedroom with the garden view. It wasn't a conventional arrangement, but it worked. When it was time for cake, Matthew and Danielle stood together while their daughters and a dozen kindergartners sang off-key. 6 candles flickered above frosting mountains, and 3 pairs of hazel eyes reflected the light with pure happiness. "Make a wish," Danielle said. The girls conferred in whispered conspiracy, then blew together, extinguishing all 6 candles in one breath. The yard erupted in applause. After cake and chaos, after presents were opened and children were retrieved by grateful parents, after the backyard was restored to something resembling order, Matthew gathered the girls in the living room. "I have something for you," he said, pulling 3 small boxes from his pocket. Ava, Chloe, and Ella crowded close, their post-party energy finally settling into curiosity. Inside each box was a golden locket, simple and delicate, sized perfectly for 6-year-old necks. "Open them," Matthew said. Each locket opened to reveal a tiny photo, Matthew on one side, Danielle on the other, and an engraving on the back. Ava read hers first, her reading skills already advanced. AMC. "You were always mine." She looked up with shining eyes. "What does that mean?" Matthew's throat tightened. "It means that even when I didn't know you existed, you were still my daughter. Even when I wasn't there, you were still mine. And I was always yours, even if I was too scared to admit it." Chloe studied her locket with typical analytical intensity. "So we belonged to you even before you knew us?" "Yes," Matthew said. "Always." Ella held her locket like treasure. "Can we wear them every day?" "Every single day," Matthew promised, helping each girl fasten the delicate chains. Danielle watched from the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. After the girls were finally miraculously asleep, worn out from celebration and sugar, Matthew found Danielle on the front porch, wrapped in a cardigan against the early evening chill. "Room for one more?" he asked. She patted the space beside her on the steps. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle into twilight. A year ago, they'd been strangers bound by biology and regret. Now they were something harder to define, not quite together, not quite separate, but undeniably family. "They're 6, Danielle said softly. "I can't believe they're already 6. "You've done an amazing job with them," Matthew said. "They're smart and kind and confident. That's all you." "Not all me anymore," Danielle said. "You've been showing up, Matthew. Really showing up. They know they have a father who loves them." "I should have been there from the beginning." "You should have," Danielle agreed, and the honesty didn't sting anymore, just settled between them as fact. "But you're here now. That matters." Matthew looked at the woman beside him, the one he'd loved and lost and found again in the most painful, necessary way. She was different now. Stronger. More guarded in some ways. More open in others. The easy trust of their early relationship was gone, replaced by something more complex and hard-won. "Can I ask you something?" Matthew said. "Depends on the question." "Do you think," he paused, choosing words carefully, "do you think we'll ever be more than co-parents? Or is that door closed?" Danielle was quiet for a long moment, and Matthew prepared himself for the answer he probably deserved. "I don't know," she finally said. "A year ago I would have said that door was locked, boarded up, and burned down. But watching you with them, seeing you choose them over your father's empire, over your old life, seeing you become the man I thought you were 5 years ago." She trailed off, and Matthew waited, barely breathing. "I'm not ready to say yes to forever," Danielle continued. "I might not be ready for a long time. You broke something in me, Matthew, and it's still healing. But I'm not saying no either. I'm saying maybe. I'm saying let's keep doing this, showing up, co-parenting, being family, and see where it goes." "I can live with maybe," Matthew said. "I can live with earning it day by day." Danielle smiled, soft and genuine. "Good. Because that's all I've got right now." She leaned against him then, her head resting on his shoulder in a gesture that felt like a door opening. Not all the way, but enough to let light through. They sat together as the stars emerged, listening to the quiet neighborhood sounds and the peaceful silence of 3 little girls sleeping upstairs, dreaming whatever 6-year-olds dream. It wasn't the fairy tale ending Matthew had once imagined love should be. There was no grand declaration, no perfect resolution, no guarantee of happily ever after. But there were 3 daughters who knew they were loved. There was a woman who'd survived his worst and was slowly learning to trust his best. There was a brownstone that was becoming a home. There was tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days beyond where Matthew would wake up and choose them again. It was messy and complicated and still healing from old wounds. It was real. And sitting on the porch with Danielle's head on his shoulder, Matthew realized that real was exactly what he'd been missing his entire life. What he'd traded for empires and approval and the illusion of control. He'd lost 5 years. He'd lost his father's fortune and his mother's final years of knowing her granddaughters. He'd lost the easy love he and Danielle had once shared. But he'd gained 3 perfect, impossible daughters. He'd gained a second chance he didn't deserve. He'd gained a future he was finally brave enough to build one day at a time. "Thank you," Matthew whispered into Danielle's hair, "for letting me try again. For giving me the chance to be their father." "Thank you for showing up," Danielle whispered back. "For choosing them. For choosing us." Above them, the lights in the girls' bedrooms glowed warm. Inside, 3 lockets rested on 3 nightstands, engraved with a truth that had always been there, waiting for Matthew to be brave enough to claim it. "You were always mine." They were. They always had been. And now, finally, Matthew was theirs too. Not perfect. Not without scars. But present. Consistent. There. A family found in grief and built in grace. Imperfect, healing, and choosing love anyway. One day at a time. Together. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.